Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scherr.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb.
Today we are joined by freshman Senator Grant Hauschild. Hauschild was elected in 2022 and represents the largest and most rural Senate district in northern Minnesota. With Senator Hauschild, we are going to break down why he decided to run for office and how his more centrist views work at a hyper-partisan time. We will also break down his decision to focus on reinserting civility in politics and working with members of all parties to get things done for Minnesotans. Our conversation with Senator Hauschild was a political palate cleanser.
And one addition to this week's episode is an opportunity I had to speak with Shannon Watson, the executive director and founder of Majority in the Middle, to talk about the final weeks of the legislative session and opportunities for Republicans and Democrats to work in a bipartisan way to finish their work on time this legislative session.
So thank you for joining us and enjoy the show. We are excited to be joined by Senator Grant Hauschild today. Now, Senator, you are in your first term in the Minnesota Senate, and we will touch on that shortly. But I want to hear a little bit about your background and how you decided to run for office. Before the show, I was looking up a little bit more about your biography, and you're a recovered political operative working in that field a little bit. So tell us about what you've done and how you got to this point.
Thanks, Becky and Michael, for having me on the show. I've been a listener for a while now, so it's fun to join you guys. That's exactly right. I've been involved in politics or policy work since I was really young, and I don't really come from a political family. I still remember the look on my mom's face when I said I wanted to go get involved in campaigns. I think not always something that parents dream for their kids to get involved in politics. No, but it's been a great experience. I've done campaigns where I grew up in North Dakota for a long time. I spent some time in Washington, D.C., working in the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the Obama administration. I went on to work for U.S. Senator Heidi, who was a moderate Democrat in the U.S. Senate. And then I eventually made the move to Minnesota. My wife is from Minnesota, and we wanted to live in northern Minnesota where we have beautiful outdoors and great communities. And so we moved there for her career, and I found myself exploring politics here in Minnesota as well.
Fantastic. And you stepped into this kind of role as a member serving your community at a very hyper-partisan time. So what went into that, really stepping into that, and likely knowing that with that comes a lot of arrows back at you?
Yeah, that's one of the things I think I hate most about politics is how the extremes pull us into these camps that make it so we can't work together or do things to actually improve people's lives. And it feels like with both parties, oftentimes you see that happen more and more. And so one of the things that I really talked a lot about during the campaign was trying to stay out of the nonsense that we see in politics and focusing on delivering for people, delivering for our communities, and really the economic side of policy work. And I think when you focus on economics, when you focus on deliverables, you can find a lot in common with people because everybody wants to achieve results for the constituents they represent. And so the things I focused on are things like childcare, emergency medical services. How can we make our permitting structure better in Minnesota so our companies can open up new businesses and hire more people? So things that I think matter to pocketbooks for our constituents is what I've focused on.
We reached out to you after, and there's been some discussion about civility in politics, and there's an op-ed that you had wrote for the Duluth News Tribune about northern Minnesota where it's fighting for in St. Paul. You have a very large district in terms of a land space. I think it's the largest and most rural Senate district in Minnesota. You go from the North, you go from Lake Superior all the way. How far west do you go?
Almost to Baudette, if you can believe that, almost half the Canadian border.
Wow.
So go ahead.
Yeah, just half the Canadian border in Minnesota. So it's a substantially sized district, about the size of Massachusetts.
About the size of Massachusetts. So let's talk a little bit about how civility and the importance of going to the legislature and focusing your legislative approach on civility benefits your legislative district.
I think when we come together and we hear the different perspectives of all these different legislators that represent different parts of our state, when we listen to everybody and get insight from everybody, that's how we get the best policy. I said on the floor yesterday regarding an issue we were talking about, nobody's going to get 100% of what you want. If you only vote for something that you 100% agree with, then our legislative body would be completely defunct, right? We would never get anything done. We'd be like the United States Congress, in my opinion. And so I think coming to a compromise and hearing people's voices is important. I just want to add, you brought up my rural nature of the district I represent. And that's a little bit of a unique perspective I bring to the DFL these
Correct.
days. There's not very many greater Minnesota DFL members of the legislature. And given that I do represent such a rural district, oftentimes when we are talking about the policy implications of the policies we're advancing, I bring up the rural nature of how that will affect that policy and bringing the voice of those rural constituents to the table. And I think that's really important. And it's where I find a lot of camaraderie with Republican members of the legislature. How do we stand up for greater Minnesota? How do we stand up for our most rural communities?
With the transition of not I don't want to mass generalize, but on both in both parties at the legislature, the fringes, the most extremes are the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? How do you find working within the DFL caucus being more, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but a little bit more moderate, a little bit more center left, and working so bipartisanly with, ooh, bipartisanly, someone's going to have my head for that one, in such a bipartisan nature with Republicans. Do is anybody within the caucus, and I'm not asking to name names, but do people give you a hard time for that? Do they want to suck you in a little bit more to the far left, or are they okay with your approach, knowing that you're representing your district?
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point, which is it feels like almost on every issue, somebody says, I better go talk to Grant because I got to find out where he's at. And it comes from both the Republicans and the Democrats. And so that's where I start to, I think, be sometimes, unfortunately, an inch deep and a mile wide on a lot of policies because I really do have to bring a voice to a lot of different policies and make sure that perspective is brought to the table. And I do actually enjoy that opportunity because it gives me a chance to really touch a lot of different legislation and bring a unique voice. But to answer your question, people don't give me a hard time. They understand the position that I'm in, they understand the district that I represent, and I have to bring that voice to the table. And again, as long as you approach things from a compromise position, as long as you understand that you're going to bring both voices to the table, I find a lot in common with my progressive colleagues and my conservative colleagues. It just depends on the issue.
I think that's great. I think that's a great perspective, and that's exactly one of the reasons that we wanted to talk to you. Is, as we've said before, this is the exact type of conversation we want to have on our podcast is to have discussions with people who are from different political parties and have different perspectives. We have spoken with very conservative members of the legislature, very liberal members of the legislature, progressive on various. It's just so good to have people talking. And what I'm hearing so much about you in your approach is it's based on conversations and discussions. And Becky is right in the kind of the question she framed out, but it would also be applicable to someone who identified in a similar way on the Republican side. There's always that tug. There's always that tug by the extremes on both sides. And not as in essence of passing judgment on the pull that happens in both either the Democrat or the Republican Party. It's just a reality of the nature of parties. And it's so interesting to hear another example of a legislator coming on and talking about focusing on conversations and issues, because that's the part of the process that we try to identify and raise the voices of people on this podcast. And so just wanted to note that it was interesting to hear you talk about the process and how much it was based in conversation. And that's what's so important to do. And just a tip of the cap at you for having that type of approach, because it's good to hear, it's good to know, and it's good to see happening at the legislature.
I appreciate that, Michael. And I really believe that 90% of the issues we face in this world are communication problems. It's simply a fact that people aren't communicating, aren't understanding one another. So the more communication opportunities we can open up on policy, I think the better we're going to be at finding solutions to the issues we face.
Talk a bit about your Northland Strong initiative that you put forward ahead of this 2024 legislative session.
I appreciate you asking about that. Given the size of my district and how many rural communities I represent that are quite frankly far away from where I might live, I wanted to find a way to best connect with my constituents in an efficient and effective way. Other legislators that are in more urban places can have a town hall, and everybody in that community has pretty easy access, right, to get there and voice their opinion. So instead, with my Northland Strong initiative, I focused on 5 core areas: strong families, safe communities, protecting our outdoor heritage, making sure Minnesota stays a state that works, and then innovative economies, or making sure that we have a strong economy. Long story short, I went about creating these roundtables in these various rural communities where I could bring stakeholders together, constituents together to talk about those issues, get their perspective on those themes, and then bring a legislative package to the legislator this year so that I'm staying focused on what people actually asked of me rather than getting pulled into maybe some of the influence groups that are trying for bigger agendas. I want to focus on what matters to the Northland, and that's why it's called Northland Strong. It's about making sure my region is strong, and I'm focusing on the issues people care about.
Now, as you mentioned, obviously you were elected in your district, but there are not as many Democrat elected officials in greater Minnesota and very often kind of Trump country up there, right? How do you find these kind of conversations when you are at there? Are there some people that can still come in guns blazing? Or as we talked with some other members, other folks too, it's hard to hate up close, right? Once you're there and you're showing you're accessible, having these conversations, does that kind of tamp down that energy a little bit?
It absolutely does, Becky. I think you're right. When you are out front, when you present yourself to be available to constituents, they are far less likely to come and yell at you or say, I am so mad at you for XYZ vote. Instead, when you present it with a theme of trying to deliver for the communities, or when you present it as a theme of a challenge we all face, then people come more so with a mindset of solutions or a mindset of ideas than I'm opposed to you because you're a Democrat or because you're a Republican. And that's why I think having sort of those thematic guidelines is an effective way to host town halls and roundtables. And that's what I found with this initiative.
What Becky just said is also one of the things that we've tried to do in this podcast, and why, again, we reached out to you. You can have a podcast and you can have a discussion where it's just two guests, two hosts just yelling at each other. And trust me, there's a lot that Becky probably wants to yell at me about. And there's probably some things that I could spar back with. But one of the opportunities we have is talking with Democrats and Republicans, even when they disagree. And Becky and I are both identify as Republicans. You are a Democrat. The fact that you came on this podcast and are willing to talk to us is exactly what more needs to happen. Those are the type of conversations that needs to happen. You could have gotten this invitation. Could have gotten this invitation and said, Becky, Michael used to be a really partisan hack, and Becky was also a partisan hack. They've both worked for partisan entities. There's no way I'm going on there to have that type of discussion. The fact you're willing to come on and talk about it, it does lower the temperature. It does lower. I think Becky and I have been so surprised by the reaction there's been to just us talking with people as we would in everyday life. And just again, hearing you talk about these issues, it's just great. And it's so good that you were willing to come on and be an advocate for issues, even though we may disagree on the focus of those issues. And that's what I think what needs to happen more. And what you're doing every day at the legislature, where your arm's getting twisted a little bit and you might be twisting other people's arm, that's the type of politics that needs to be identified right now. And that's the type of discussion that needs to happen. And really proud of you for coming in as a freshman legislator and taking on that type of meaty kind of subject of civility in politics.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Michael. And that's exactly what we've found with the Civility Caucus is that when you bring all these people around the table of different partisanships, different regions, different backgrounds, oftentimes what you find happen is people start talking about the similarities they have, the commonalities. One of the issues that I've heard talked about is this idea of where people are at in the stages of their life. A lot of us in the legislature are young parents. Some are former business owners, and they bring that perspective of how is this going to impact small businesses? And that's a perspective that many of us don't have. So it's interesting to hear that perspective, right? So we know how policy impacts those things. Again, the rural divide versus the suburban divide. There's a lot of different issues that people bring to the table. And when you have that civility caucus opportunity to say, hey, we're not here to argue, we're not on the floor debating a bill, we're here to just talk to each other, to open up dialogue, to talk about the things that bring us together, then I think when you do start talking about policy, you're that much more likely to go to that person and say, hey, I heard you say that you have young kids. I'm working on this childcare issue. How can we find a way to work together on some things that we might agree on? And that's, I think, the best success we can find from the Civility Caucus.
That's
Now,
fantastic.
you hit on something, and I'm going to get into the young kids here shortly. But first, I want to talk about age in general. You're on the younger side of the legislative or the legislators serving our state. And also, and again, mass generalization here, but it don't see a lot of moderate Democrats coming up through the college system these days. Now, North Dakota is not maybe a very flaming liberal kind of organization, but tell us how you got to where you are in that mindset and how that works. Because I know as a younger Republican, I have a lot of friends that I very much disagree with, and we have good conversations and all that. But how was that kind of coming through and being more on the moderate side of the Democrats, both through college and with folks your age and then in the legislature?
Yeah, it's a great question, Becky. I think a lot of it has to do with that very upbringing. And growing up in North Dakota at the time, we had a lot of blue dog Democrats. For those that are unfamiliar with that term, because there's not very many of them left, it was the moderate rural caucus of the Democratic Party nationally. And our full federal delegation in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana were all Democrats at one point. And that's really the generation I grew up in. And so I found mentors that were in that type of atmosphere and latched onto those campaigns. I got involved on the policies that they cared about, like standing up for farmers, particularly family farmers, labor, the unions, a lot of those groups that make up the traditional Democratic Farmer Labor Party. And I think that has a lot of influence. And I think you're right to a degree that the young people coming up perhaps in more urban places or maybe in our college system, they also bring a different perspective. They see the impacts on the immigrant community. They see the impacts faced in our criminal justice system. And that also brings an important perspective for all of us. I think the most important thing is that we have a diversified perspective in the legislature. That we have these different areas represented, because I can't tell you the number of times I have talked to either progressive colleagues or conservative colleagues and thought, oh, I was wrong. I was not thinking about that and how it impacts a certain group of people. And I think that's why the legislative body is one of the best bodies to be a part of, because those different perspectives are at the table.
I love that. I think it's incredible the mindset that you're looking at this with, because I completely agree. We've talked about that before, that I think sometimes the best ways I can either change my mind or even strengthen my opinion is having conversations with people on the other side and hearing what is there, and it can help regulate in my mind how I want to message or talk about some things. Great mindset. We need more like you. And then you're a young parent. You've got two young kids, right?
That's right. Yeah. 4 year old and a 2 year old.
So
Congratulations.
my son's almost 2, so I can fully appreciate what you're doing, but I have a flexibility of I get to work from home most days of the week. I go into the office 2 days a week. Small firm, very flexible. Kids are sick all the time. How do you balance? We have the privilege of having a number of young parents up at the legislature, yourself included. Talk to us a little bit about that balancing act on both actually getting to the Capitol and doing your job when you have a sick child, but also being able to have that perspective. Let's start there. We'll get into the childcare thing here shortly.
The young parent perspective is such a critical one at the legislature. And it's really, I think, shown a bipartisanship on a lot of issues that were not talked about in previous generations in the legislature when it was traditionally more retired or older folks. And that's really important. But I will say I have the ability to do what I do because I have such a supportive family. I have a supportive wife who knows that this is a passion of mine, that I'm at my best when I am doing policy work. But it does make it really hard, particularly being a greater Minnesota member who lives 2.5 hours away from the capital. Being away from family is hard on us. And that's a unique perspective I also bring to the DFL, is not just being that young parent, but also uh, in a more rural area away from the capital. So you're right. If I have a sick kid, there have been times where I've had to vote remotely. And that's something I think we need to protect, because it's not always the case that our greater Minnesota members can be right there in St. Paul. And that's a conversation we're having right now at the legislature, is should we allow that for sick kids? But yeah, it's not easy, but I want to show my kids that we have to follow our passion and be our best selves. And I think me being in the legislature is what I've always wanted to do. And I have a family that really encourages me, which is humbling for sure.
And I don't think a lot of people truly acknowledge the sacrifice that parents who have children at home are making, whether you live and get to go home every night or have to travel back and forth on the weekends. I think it is truly a sacrifice. So that certainly should be acknowledged. But then I want to also go into, we are at a point where there's economy is wild, gas, eggs, everything. Childcare is something you've talked about. Now, this is something we have one, are hoping to have two at some point in the future. And childcare is just astronomical. Talk to us a little bit, because I know that's a priority of yours, but also I live in the suburbs where we have so much more options and opportunities here for childcare. But speak about why that's important for you as a priority and how that is in your district.
Childcare is so critical because it's not just about the family themselves having access to childcare, although I'll come back to that because it is so critical for families. But I do want to talk a little bit about my district. It is so rural, and we have these very isolated communities where I quite literally hear from them that they don't have childcare. And when you're talking about trying to get industry to open up in northern Minnesota, small businesses to be able to operate, restaurants along Main Street of Ely, Minnesota, and you don't have childcare even available at all, that is something that completely debilitates the economic growth of a community. And I think you're exactly right that maybe the more suburban members or urban members, while struggling with the cost of childcare, don't understand that greater Minnesota is struggling with even having it at all. So that's the first sort of unique perspective that I've brought. Number two, having childcare for young families is about vibrancy of our communities. If young families are not starting to have kids, if they're delaying kids or having less, we have to realize our domestic growth in America is nearly at a point of being stagnant. And that is a scary prospect for the future growth of our country. And it's because of these economic pressures that are facing modern day young people, from student loans, housing costs, inflation, and childcare. So, my perspective is that right now, childcare is a market failure. And from a moderate Democrat perspective, when things are a market failure, it's okay for the government to step in and help where it's needed. And I think providing a subsidy for middle class families to try to just make childcare a little bit more accessible allows them to consider starting a family a little bit earlier, making sure we have kids riding bikes on our streets, our schools full, and our rural communities not shrinking and businesses opening up. So it impacts all of us, and we need people of all ages to understand childcare is about all of us.
Senator, before we go here today, I have one more question to ask, and it really gets into also one of the things that Becky and I are trying to do on this podcast. We live in a very hyper-partisan time right now. We're coming into a presidential election cycle that is going to just be ugly. Do you have some advice? You are a member of the legislature, you're the member of the Senate, you've staked out a claim on civility. Do you have some advice to our listeners on how people who want to focus on the good this election cycle? People are going to vote, people are going to be inundated with ads, but you have some advice for people on how to engage and have discussions with people from different political parties and find a way to still remain friends and still work together, because I think we're going to have a lot of ugliness. But in that kind of ugliness, there's people like you that are out there staking the claim with some of your colleagues that we need to find a way to work together. So give some advice if you can.
I think what we need to do is listen to the supporters that we have, the people that are of the same mindset as us. We need to keep those folks close, have those conversations, figure out how we're going to advance the goals that we have. But we can't just do that. We can't just talk to our side or our supporters or our party. We have to have those conversations and then figure out, what does the opposing side think? What are other people saying? What are the stakeholders and the experts on this issue saying? Because if we stay too in our party or in our partisan lanes, we're going to miss an entire perspective that's going to cause us to advance bad policy. The second thing I would say for voters in particular is focus on the people that are doing the work. There's a lot of blowhards. There's a lot of people that shout. There's a lot of people that say things that sound really good. But if you follow along, even just at the margins in your local newspapers, in op-eds, finding what policies actually passing, find the workers, find the people actually advancing and having the conversations that are good for our state, and vote for them regardless of party. Find the people that are doing the good work and not just throwing stones. And I think that's how we will advance a better state, regardless of if it's Republicans in the majority or Democrats. Vote for the people doing the work.
I love that. I think that's a really great way to look at it. This has just been a very warm, fuzzy feeling kind of conversation, because I do think that this is what we want more of. We want to get back. This is what politics used to be, of how can we work with the other side? How can we get things done together, and not just how can I get all of what I want with giving them nothing. So it's hopeful and optimistic knowing that there are Democrats like you in office and serving your district, which obviously shows you're serving them well and having the meetings and doing the work. So thank you for all of that. We absolutely want to have you back at some point, maybe deep dive into some policy, really nerd out over something like that. We'd love that. In the meantime, are you on social? Where can people follow you, find you if they want to see what you're doing and what's next?
Yeah, I'd welcome folks to follow me on Facebook. I think you could just search my name for Minnesota State Senate, and then on Twitter at Grant_Hauschild. Would love folks to follow me on there as well.
Sounds great. We look forward to chatting with you again soon, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael and Becky. Appreciate your show.
Becky, we just interviewed Senator Hauschild. Your take?
It was just really, like I said, warm and fuzzy feelings, right? I love anybody who seeks to serve their community in a way to make their community better and to work with whoever wants to work together to make that happen. And it really seems that he's in it for the right reasons. He's willing to work with far left, far right, moderates to get the job done, to make things broadband, infrastructure, childcare, and this Northland Strong initiative that he's doing, traveling all around his state, having those round tables. You can't get better than that, than having accessibility when you are going to the people that you are serving. And it was just really nice to see a different change of pace from a lot of what we see in the news of what young Democrats are. And again, that I don't want to mass generalize and bash what young Democrats look like and stand for. But traditionally, they do seem to be a little bit more on the further left. Probably a lot of young Republicans are on the MAGA or Trump side. So I get that. And it was just very refreshing, very energizing. Like him a lot. This was my first interaction with him, and it was just really good hopes for having him in the Senate and serving the state.
I agree with everything you said. It was incredibly invigorating to speak with him. Just a couple of process things. Saw some tweets on social media about the Civility Caucus. Sent him a DM on Twitter. We both follow each other. Worked with his staff. He responded very quickly. He had listened to the show, worked with the staff to get this interview done. Could not have been easier, could not have been more responsive, could not have been more accessible, could not have been easier to get on the podcast. And his accessibility, I think, and his openness and the work of his staff to make him available beyond was just remarkable. And so my compliments to him, not only on the civility approach of how he's focusing his legislative career, but also just his accessibility and that of his staff. I absolutely am surprised, continue to be surprised based on kind of the hyper-partisan nature of my past and the way I operated and did things, which I'm not walking away from. Mm-hmm. How rewarding at this time in my life it is to talk with Democrats, to talk with people I disagree with, people on the Republican side that I disagree with, Democrats that I speak with that I disagree with. This is so much fun. And this is why having a podcast is so great, because we had an opportunity to talk to a DFL senator, centrist DFL senator from northern Minnesota, who's doing great work. And that type of conversation came because we were willing to have these types of discussions, but also because our guests are too. A reminder that people don't have to accept our invitations to come on. But when they do, boy, oh boy, am I appreciative of it. And that was just a great discussion to have, because there's a lot of ugliness in politics, and it's every single day. And I think one of the things that we're trying to carve out is a continual try to draw attention to sometimes some of the best that's going on in politics. We cover obviously some tough issues over the history of this podcast, but having these kind of palate cleansers, or the kind of these mind cleans that we do when we get these type of legislators to come on, or when we're talking about these types of subjects, it really resets the brain, and it allows us to it's just a good kind of cleansing moment, a moment of Zen, I should say, in kind of this podcast discussion, to speak to someone. And again, a lot of our conversations with Democrats and Republicans do that, but this one was a little bit extra, and I appreciated the opportunity of him to come on.
Thank you for reaching out to him and his staff, and we're glad it worked out. And definitely, we'll get some policy deep dive with him in the future. I feel it.
We'll get some more. Thanks for doing this, Becky.
Bye.
I am very excited on a Friday early afternoon to be talking with Shannon Watson, the founder and executive director of Majority in the Middle, one of the feel-good organizations that exists in this messy partisan world. And Shannon, thanks for joining me today.
Absolutely, Michael. Good to see you.
We're in a very unique situation based on some developments at the state capitol in terms of the partisanship and gridlock that could exist.
Yeah, a little bit.
Your organization, and you in particular, have been so thoughtful about encouraging bipartisanship, civility, and politics. And I wanted just to take a moment, and as we end the kind of week and come into what's likely going to be a little bit of a chaotic legislative session, get your thoughts and perspective as to how legislators on both sides of the aisle could approach what may be a more tenuous political situation than people had previously thought.
Absolutely. That 34-33 majority was always going to be a thing, with Senator Dietzig being out fighting cancer, and then Senator Port has long COVID, and so that has some health situations for her, and then just other senators dealing just with life. This was always a sort of a tenuous situation. And one of the things that I've been really heartened by, and the reason that I'm not necessarily so worried about what's going to happen in the next 4 or 5 weeks, is because I'm already seeing a lot of bipartisanship happening. So I think they've already set that stage, and they can, if they just keep going down that path, I think that they are in a really good position to find the bipartisan cooperation on things and end the session in a way that it doesn't have to be terrible and angsty. And there'll be some of that, because there always is. But it can be a good outcome for most everybody involved.
Let me ask you a question on kind of the role of partisanship. Obviously, we have members of the legislature run for, these are partisan offices. There was a time years ago where there wasn't party designation, but there is. And so partisanship seems to be becoming more and more of in some ways, a problem in terms of getting solutions. And so how would you, if you could wave a wand in these final 4 to 5 weeks, what would be the recipe and the ingredients needed to have there be a bipartisan solution in this remaining few weeks, knowing very full well that the partisan makeup of the legislature is one that Democrats have control in both the House, the Senate, and in the governor's office? How can there be a bipartisan arrangement and agreement in these final weeks that Minnesotans can be proud of?
Yeah, the partisanship is interesting because not only does it give people a shorthand way to describe what they believe, but it's the organizing function of the legislature. Your caucus is the organizing thing, and who's in charge has to do with party affiliation. So there's some of that structural partisanship that I think it can get in the way of the relationship building. And one of the duos I've been spending a lot of time watching the last couple of weeks are Senator Scott Dibble and Senator Jasinski, because those two have a really good partnership in the Transportation Committee. They have for years. Transportation Conference Committee met yesterday, and Jasinski talked about this as they were getting done, that those two have worked together for X number of years. I don't remember if it was like 8 or 10. And they've really built up their bank of trust between the two of them. So like they know that they're going to be able to talk to each other. Even if they don't agree, they're going to give each other the space and the time to debate amendments and do the thing. Senate Transportation had a really long hearing on third deadline in a way that I had some friends who had bills on that agenda and they were like, oh, this is taking forever. But when it takes forever, that means that everybody is given the space and the time to be heard. And I think that comes down on the frustration level. I've watched, particularly in the House, there are some of the committees where they had a lot of fidelity to committee schedule and that time. And so members of the minority got really frustrated when they didn't have the opportunity to ask all of their questions or give all of their amendments. And so what Senate Transportation is showing, that even if all the amendments don't go through, if people are allowed to participate in the process, then they accept the outcome, whatever that is. So I've been watching some of that. And then just the bills that have gotten through. So we've had 12 bills in 2024 that have passed both chambers and enacted into law. And of those 12, none of them were 33-34 votes. I think the lowest one was 37-28. And I think 4 of them were unanimous in the Senate. And so that shows that there's already a lot of bipartisanship happening. And so I encourage, particularly senators, but House members as well, to keep leaning into that and find the things. They don't have to agree on everything. Nobody expects them to agree on everything. But when they can leave the omnibus bills to the stuff that they disagree about, pull out the things that they do agree, I think there's opportunity there.
I would agree in that situation. And I'm a glass half full person. And part of and I always have, and it's really what I'm a partly sunny versus partly cloudy, glass half full.
There you go.
There
Yes.
has to be opportunities there. And what I really liked was the email that you sent out a couple days ago, just talking about your perspective on this potential for a 33-33 split. You were so optimistic about the opportunity that it presented. And it was such a refreshing take, because partisanship is on both sides. It happens. No one is more guilty on another side. But when it comes down to actually doing the work that Minnesotans want, it is a situation where there has to be progress, and there has to be a process, and there has to be collaboration. Yeah. And I think it was such an important message that you sent that email. It was in the rancor of everything that was going on. It was great to just get a positive message about the opportunity that exists and how this is an opportunity for Republicans and Democrats to work together in these final days and pull together through what is likely going to be a more partisan situation than we would have already thought.
It has the potential to be. And so in my mind, it has the potential to be better too. And I think we spent a lot of time in 2023 talking about how we had this huge freshman class incoming. So it was 68 or 86, I don't remember, number of members who were new to their roles in the legislature in 2023. And so most people who get elected to the legislature, they don't understand how partisan it is until they get there. And they start figuring out how things were run and how the caucus systems work and, where their offices are and how floor sessions are really more performative than anything else. And so we've got a lot of people who are still in their first term who are not super entrenched in the partisanship and are super willing to reach across the aisle and find things that they can agree on. And I think if they have the freedom and opportunity to do that, then that can be like, it's a much better environment. It's like a better work environment for everybody if we can cut down some of that angst and stress and all of that.
Here's, in some ways, how I describe my partisan journey. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Monsters, Inc. But there's, in the movie Monsters, Inc., at the beginning of the movie, they realize that scaring kids is a way to get energy. And that's how they fuel kind of monster world. But at the end of the movie, they realize that it's laughter that's so much more powerful. And I have a very partisan past. So what I've come to realize as I've gotten a little older and as I've been less in kind of the arena of politics, what really seems to excite me is when there's just good solutions and people working in a collaborative way. And one of the things that you've touched on is that the bipartisan work is going on.
Yeah.
And it's already there. But what sometimes I think it gets clouded out, or it gets blocked a little bit by the partisan rancor, because that's what gets the
Yes.
headlines. When in
Yes.
reality, we should be focusing more on the relationships that you've discussed here, where members on different sides of the aisle are finding ways to work together.
Yeah, absolutely. And when members get attention and headlines and all the other things that come with an attention economy, when they do that, then they will lean into those things that get them the attention. And when media is, in fairness, like media has a bias towards conflict and media has a bias towards fairness, and that's okay. But when we lean into that conflict narrative, then I think we give people attention for the wrong things. And so if we can highlight, and that's one of the things that my organization tries to do, if we can highlight the instances of people working together and give them credit and give them kudos that they should get, then not only is that, I think, the right thing to do, but it's also a way to encourage that behavior amongst everybody.
In some instances, sometimes politics and media does not reward the best behavior. They reward
Absolutely.
the conflict. And in this particular situation, I think it's so important what you've detailed here about the bipartisan work. And it's just better for all of us as if we could find a way to work together, Republicans and Democrats, on solutions in a collaborative way. I think those are the most important stories that need to be told in the legislative session. Does your organization, or do you have will you be at the Capitol more or less in the coming weeks? Are you going to be looking for opportunities to tamper down some of the animosity? Because unfortunately, there's a potential for things to spiral here. And
Right.
how do we keep the focus? How do we keep the focus on the good that's being done and the end product that Minnesotans so desperately want?
I try to practice what I preach. I do spend a lot of time at the Capitol. I was just over there today and run back here. And when I see senators or representatives going out of their way to keep things civil at a minimum, or work across the aisle or whatever, I will send private messages. We'll do things on social sometimes too, but I send a lot of private emails and like, hey, I really appreciated your perspective on that. Or, hey, I understand that you have been the bulldog in this committee for the entire session. And while I understand that this is your role, you're keeping the tone really positive, and I appreciate that. And thank you. And I get a lot of responses to those because honestly, that's not the communication that a lot of people are getting right now. They get a lot of, you should vote this way, or you should vote that way, or this thing is terrible, or that thing is great. And it's almost never supportive. It's all about what we want you to do. So just remembering that elected officials are human beings and that sometimes they need to know that people notice. I appreciate Eric Putnam's dad jokes. They break the tension a lot. And I had let him know that earlier in session. I appreciate the dad jokes, and keep that stuff up because it does make a difference.
Yep. And one of the things that Becky and I are trying to do on this podcast is to identify folks who want to be part of a responsible discussion. We embrace and recognize the partisanship.
Yes.
But having a platform where people can talk and we can learn from each other, I think, is so critically important. And your organization is leading the way on that and leading that discussion. And that's why I thought it was so important, particularly as we release this episode this week, potentially with what's going to be coming next week and what we're the kind of situation we're in right now, that just we kind of ground people and have maybe a potential reset on some of the partisanship and look for the opportunities that exist, because that's what I think Minnesotans want. I think Minnesotans want government to work in a functional way. And Minnesotans like to think that they're exceptional at everything and that we have a great reputation. But as people who follow the legislative process know, that it can be ugly, it can be messy. Sometimes the work doesn't get done on time. But there are still opportunities for people to work together. Just in wrapping this up, what advice would you have, if you'd be willing to share, for the public, for legislators, for lobbyists, for people that are there observing this process, how they can contribute more to there being a positive outcome rather than just focusing on any drama or rancor or other type of issues?
It was like, I'm human too. And so I was scrolling through Twitter a lot earlier this week, and I'll keep scrolling through Twitter, and we all digest the beefy news. And that's not a reference to Steak on the Stick Day. That was Thursday, but
Goodness, that sounds like a fantastic day on Day on the Hill.
Yes, it's one of the best ones. Puppy Day, Steak on a Stick Day, Ice Cream Day, the Park Lambs Day, the one where Yes, that's coming up. That's in about a week, or maybe it's next week.
There's nothing like animals to just break the partisan tension. I mean,
Yeah,
who can mad if
absolutely.
there's lambs and there's puppies and steak and other types of stuff, but getting animals at the Capitol, that's the recipe to break the tension.
Absolutely. And that's a good place for people to interact and take the partisanship aside and just bond over, isn't this lamb cute? Or this steak is awesome. Those are things that we agree on. And those are the building blocks of relationships in ways that we don't really think about. So taking the opportunity, get out of your office, get out of the committee meeting, come to those opportunities and interact with other people. The thing I constantly champion with voters and normal Minnesotans, if you care about legislators working together, if you really want them to collaborate and come to agreement and find not necessarily the mushy middle, but find the things that they can agree on, please let your elected representatives know that, because they need to hear that directly from you. Because, like I said, right now they're hearing a lot from activists and lobbyists and each other about how they should vote on bills. And even if you don't care about a particular outcome of a bill, but just that we really want a little less partisanship, a little more civility, and finding that way to get along, those emails and those phone calls go a long way.
Are you, and just to clarify, you said normal people. Are you saying that we're not normal for following this closely?
I do not classify myself as normal. No, I think if you can name just off the top of your head more than half of the 201 legislators, you're probably not normal in this realm. But
Yes. I think it's fair to say that that's a good point. If the Grammys are on or some the MTV
oh
Music
yeah, I have no
Videos,
idea.
I have absolutely don't know who any of those people are. I have to go. But if C-SPAN's on or the legislative coverage is on, I can rally a bunch of names pretty quick. And yes, I think it's fair to say that we're probably not normal. Shannon, thank you so much for just giving an uplifting message that we legislators, and I hope everyone that's going to be watching the legislative session partakes in. And where can people follow you and your organization to learn more about what the great work that you're doing?
Awesome. One thing I will mention before, we just amplify this. I suggest it. I try to get it on people's minds, but it's really the 201 legislators they're doing the hard work. And I want to give a shout out to Senator Mark Johnson, who's the minority leader, who really, like, this week has shown some leadership. There were more than one place where his entire caucus could have sat on their hands, and they didn't. And they came to the table, and I appreciate that. I feel like he needs to get the credit as well. As for Majority in the Middle, you can find us at majoritymiddle.com. We have a newsletter list that we encourage people to sign up for. We're not going to spam you, we promise. And we have events that we hold occasionally. There are other ways that you can connect with us. Easiest place to find me is probably still on Twitter, Shannon K. Watson. And I'm still going to call it Twitter. I'm not going to call it X.
Yes. Because if you say X, then you have to say formerly known as Twitter.
Yeah, yes. I protest and I just call it Twitter.
That's great. I can't thank you enough for being here today, for the work that your organization does. And also, I will say, thanks for sending that email, because it's what triggered this discussion and made me say, the timing would be great. And so keep doing that type of stuff and reminding people about the opportunities that exist, because the reason I wanted to talk to you today and just get just a few minutes of your time on a Friday afternoon, because I think your organization and the message that you're crafting is so important for people to hear. So please keep up the great work. And keep
thank
doing
you so
what
much,
you're
Michael.
doing,
I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. All right. Have a great weekend.
We want to thank you for listening to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. And before we go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on the platform where you listen. You can leave a review or give us a shout out on our website or across all social media platforms at BBBreakPod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will return next week. Thank you again for listening.